Chapter 8 focuses on photosynthesis. This is a really important process on the planet Earth. If it wasn't for photosynthesis, none of us would be here. So we'll start with 3 questions to see what your background is on photosynthesis. So go ahead and read the question, see what you think. Okay, so on the bottom is the mitochondria. Mitochondria is going to produce carbon dioxide and water, and that's going to be taken up by the chloroplast in photosynthesis. So C is a chloroplast. And photosynthesis is just the opposite process of cellular respiration. Okay, blank and blank are reactants for the chloroplast on top, but are products of the mitochondria on bottom. Okay, so if you pick carbon dioxide and water, you're right. Carbon dioxide and water are what we produce from burning glucose, and then plants take up carbon dioxide and water and use sunlight to produce glucose and oxygen. So the third question, we were showing the thylakoid membrane in chloroplasts, and it asks you, the figure is showing the blank, which takes place on the thylakoid membrane of chloroplasts. Okay, so the right answer is C. C is the light reactions. The light reactions take place on the thylakoid membrane of chloroplasts. And your book would call them the light-dependent reactions. So this is showing where photosynthesis is active on the planet Earth. On the land, the greener areas have more photosynthesis. So the Amazon rainforest in South America, the eastern United States has more rainfall and more photosynthesis than the western United States, with the exception of California. And even in the oceans, there's a lot of photosynthesis going on. In the oceans, they use a different scale. The green and yellow and red are more chlorophyll. So near the land areas, there's often more photosynthesis than out in the deep ocean, which have very little photosynthesis going on. Autotrophs are self-feeders that build organic molecules from inorganic molecules. So plants do photosynthesis, algae do photosynthesis, cyanobacteria do photosynthesis, so don't forget about the importance of bacteria. And about 50 years ago, they found that there were some autotrophs that were based on bacteria that did chemistry. So deep in the ocean, there are hydrothermal vents. You can click and learn more about them. And they produce heat. And there are bacteria that use that heat to build organic compounds from inorganic compounds. We are heterotrophs or other feeders. So heterotrophs either eat the vegetation directly, like these deer, or heterotrophs might be like us, omnivores or carnivores that eat the deer that have eaten the vegetation. There are a lot of good videos on photosynthesis, so here are 2. So when you get a chance, go back to the PowerPoints and look at some of these videos. So what photosynthesis does is it makes sugars, it makes organic molecules. And how does it do that? It does that by combining water from the soil and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and putting them together using the energy of sunlight. Oxygen is released as a byproduct. That happened about 1 billion years into Earth's history. The first organisms were bacteria that ate on the rich organic soup of the Earth. And they were here about 3.5 billion years ago. And it took about 1 billion years until we got photosynthetic organisms. So where do the materials to do photosynthesis come from? Well, water comes from the soil. It's absorbed by plant roots. CO2 comes from the air, so there's some CO2 in the air. And then O2 is excreted back into the air, and CO2 and O2 move in and out through little pores within the leaves that can open and close, and they're called stoma or plural stomata. They're showing you stomata that's open here. And then sunlight provides the energy for this process. Again, a good video, and you can turn on closed caption, and it will explain what's going on. So here's the equation of photosynthesis. It's the opposite of the equation of cellular respiration. Instead of burning glucose using oxygen, we're producing glucose and releasing oxygen. How do we produce glucose? By combining carbon dioxide and water. So plants aren't inferior to us, they're just different. We can't get any energy out of carbon dioxide, but plants can take carbon dioxide and water and use the energy from sunlight and produce an organic molecule, sugars, which is the basis that they use to build all their other organic molecules. There are two pathways in photosynthesis: the light reactions, or your book calls them the light-dependent reactions, and the Calvin cycle. Photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast. The chloroplast contains two membranes around it. Chloroplast arose from endosymbiosis. They were swallowed up by another cell that enslaved them. Inside the inner membrane is where all the action is. And inside the inner membrane are all these flat pancake-like structures called thylakoids. The thick fluid outside of the thylakoids, but inside the inner membrane, is called the stroma. And sometimes when they have a stack of thylakoids, they'll say, well, that's the grana. So the light-dependent reactions take place within the thylakoid membranes. They're the part of the chloroplast that requires light. And the Calvin cycle is an enzymatic pathway that takes carbon dioxide and makes glucose, and that takes place within the chloroplast, but within the stroma, within the fluid within the inner membrane of the chloroplast. And this just shows that plants are what capture light energy and convert it into organic matter. Sometimes plants are called photoautotrophs because they use the energy from sunlight compared to the bacteria in the deep sea vents, which are called chemoautotrophs. We'll only talk about photoautotrophs in this class. So oftentimes I'll just say autotrophs, and I'm really just talking about photoautotrophs. So what is light? So light is particles that travel through space in a wave-like pattern. Light has no mass, so it's like a force field of energy traveling through space. And as they travel in these wave-like patterns, you can measure the wavelength. And the longer wavelengths have less energy, the shorter wavelengths have more energy. And so these electromagnetic waves that travel through space are together sometimes called the electromagnetic spectrum. And the electromagnetic spectrum consists of a lot of things we can't see. It consists of gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet radiation, visible light, infrared light, and radio waves. As the waves get longer, like radio waves, they have less energy. Things like X-rays, we know, can damage our DNA. So as they get shorter, they have more energy. Visible radiation is the kind of light we can see with our eyes. It's just a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And visible light happens to be the light that's also used by plants for photosynthesis. So here are the colors of light that we see with our eyes. And these go from 400 to 700 nanometers in wavelength. And so pigments are colored molecules that are used by plants to capture light energy. The main pigments in plants are called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll look green to our eyes because they're reflecting green lights. A lot of plants also have different kinds of carotenoids. So beta carotene is what makes carrots red. And here is showing the two chlorophylls. This is showing beta carotene. These ring structures on the head of the chlorophylls look very similar to hemoglobin. So hemoglobin and chlorophyll evolved from similar ancestral molecules. And in the middle of hemoglobin is an iron group. In the middle of chlorophyll is a magnesium group. This is called an absorption spectrum. It shows you what colors are captured by different pigments and what colors are reflected. So chlorophyll are the first peaks. And so these peaks capture blue light well, and then they reflect the green light. There's a valley here, and then they have another peak in the red. So chlorophyll seems to capture blue and red light well. The carotenoids capture some green light. Okay, so these additional pigments that plants have will often capture the colors of light that are reflected by. Okay, so this talks about what I just said, so you can read about chlorophyll A and B and beta carotene. So this is just a picture of a forest canopy, and the sunlight is captured mostly by the trees up high. So plants that live in the shade of the canopy have different concentrations of chlorophyll to better capture the lower light, the reds that come through down below. This is the thylakoid membrane within the chloroplast, and embedded in that thylakoid membrane are proteins linked to pigments. The chlorophyll is not floating freely around, but it's bound to pigments. And the chlorophyll is a pigment capturing the light. When it captures the light, it gives that light energy to two special chlorophyll molecules in the center of that complex, and they push the electrons out of the orbit of the chlorophyll, and they pass those electrons on to the next protein within the membrane. When those electrons get passed on, they're replaced by electrons ripped from the hydrogen of water. Oxygen is then released back to the atmosphere as a waste product. Hydrogen is high energy electrons, but the only reaction in biology that can rip water apart and use those high energy electrons is photosynthesis. This picture is showing you the structure of the thylakoid membrane. So inside the thylakoid membrane, we have a space called the thylakoid lumen, or the thylakoid space. Outside of the thylakoid membrane is the stroma. That's where the Calvin cycle is going to take place. And embedded within the membrane are pigment protein complexes, a number of proteins, and an ATP synthase protein. And we'll talk about what they do. So this is showing you the thylakoid membrane. Inside the thylakoid membrane is the thylakoid lumen, or the thylakoid space. Outside of the thylakoid membrane is the stroma. And within the thylakoid membrane are proteins and protein pigment complexes called photosystems. So the photosystem here, called Photosystem 2, rips the electrons off of water. Water has a high energy electron attached to the hydrogen, but the only reaction in biology that's able to rip off this electron is photosynthesis. The electrons are passed along from photosystem 2 to a bunch of proteins as they fall back down from the higher energy level. The energy of the electric current is used to pump protons, H positive, into the thylakoid lumen. So H positive can be called hydrogen ions. It's also called protons because it's a lone proton without an electron. There's a second photosystem called Photosystem One, and again it raises the electrons up to a higher level, and the electrons are added to NADP positive to make NADPH. This is analogous to NAD positive and NADH. It's a coenzyme that's an electron carrier that has a high energy reduced form, a low energy oxidized form. It has a phosphate group that NADH doesn't have, so it has a P on the end. So in the last step, ATP is created in photosynthesis. It's called photophosphorylation. It's being powered by light energy, so that's why it's called photophosphorylation. And photophosphorylation consists of the light-independent reactions running these electron transport in the thylakoid membrane on top, pumping hydrogen ions into the thylakoid lumen. And then in the last step, you have chemiosmosis. You have a hydrogen ion gradient, lots of hydrogen ions inside, thousands of times less hydrogen ions outside. So hydrogen ions rush out, the only place they're allowed to rush out, through the ATP synthase protein. And the exergonic flow of those hydrogen ions powers phosphorylation of ADP to ATP. So building ATP is a highly endergonic process, and it's powered by this downhill flow of hydrogen ions. So you have chemiosmosis in chloroplasts, just like you have it in the mitochondria. When you get a chance, again, this might be a little too high a level, but go ahead and watch this video and it'll give you a sense pictorially of what's happening within the light reaction. All right, so we're still inside the chloroplast inner membrane, but now instead of being focused on the thylakoid, we're focused on the stroma outside the thylakoid. So the two products of the light-dependent reactions are ATP and NADPH. And in the Calvin cycle, what you're going to do is you're going to take carbon dioxide, make it from a gas into a solid, and then use the hydrogen that came from water, was added on to NADPH, and use that to make CO2 into C6H12O6. So they break up the Calvin cycle into 3 steps. They say there's carbon fixation. You're taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, making it from a gas into a solid. Reduction, you're taking that carbon dioxide and adding hydrogen that came from the water and is now in the NADPH to go from a low energy carbon dioxide to a glucose. And then regeneration, you're rebuilding that 5 carbon molecule that we added the carbon dioxide onto. Here's just a bigger picture of the Calvin cycle. It was named after Melvin Calvin. And in the first step in the carbon fixation, the enzyme that does it is rubisco. It's a carboxylase enzyme. It turns out to be the most abundant enzyme in the world, the most abundant protein in the world. And so carbon dioxide fixation is a really important process. And I have a fondness for this enzyme because I used it in grad school and we measured its activity. So this is showing rubisco taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, hooking it on to this 5 carbon molecule, and it immediately breaks down into 2 3 carbon molecules shown here. These are anabolic reactions that require ATP. So the ATP that was built in photophosphorylation is used in the Calvin cycle. And then the NADPH that was built in the light-dependent reactions, again, is used in the Calvin cycle to make CO2 into CH2O, into a glucose molecule. This is showing a special form of photosynthesis called CAM metabolism or CAM photosynthesis. So here's a cactus, we're all familiar with them. And if you said, well, how are they adapted to low water use? You'd say, well, they have barrels that store water. They probably have an interesting root system. They have spines that protect them from predators eating their water. They have these ribs in the middle that can expand and contract so they don't crack when they store more water. But you wouldn't be surprised to learn there are also adaptations in their chemistry. And one thing they do is they open their stomata during the night. So during the night when the stomata are open, there's less water loss than if you open them during the day. They store them, the CO2 internally, bound to an acid. That's what's called Crassulacean acid metabolism. And then they release it internally during the day. So when the sun's up, carbon dioxide is being released internally through chemical reactions. And so by opening their stomata at night, they can take in carbon dioxide and save water. Agaves do this as well. A number of desert plants do this. This is back to giving the overall reaction and just showing that, hey, plants take up carbon dioxide and release oxygen, and we do the opposite. We consume oxygen and release carbon dioxide. All right, so go ahead and write the overall equation of photosynthesis. Flip it around and you'll have cellular respiration. Where does the energy from photosynthesis come from? Okay, where do we get our energy to do cell respiration? What organelles are involved in the processes? Look at O2 and CO2. Tell me which is a reactant, which is a product in each process. Is the process catabolic or anabolic? Are you building or breaking down the carbon compound? Is the process exergonic or energonic? And is ATP made by chemiosmosis in both processes? Okay, describe the structure of a chloroplast. Describe the details of the light reactions. Describe the details of the Calvin cycle. Look at the differences and similarities between oxidative phosphorylation in mitochondria and photophosphorylation in chloroplasts. Okay, and if you have gone through all this, you'll see that, hey, mitochondria and chloroplasts probably shared common ancestry, and then they went in different directions. Describe the role of ATP and NADPH in the Calvin cycle.